One of my favorite tasks to work with is the execute SQL task, and that's the focus of this video. I'm going to just kind of walk you through the basics, and I'm going to try to keep this to a single video. Now that may seem a little strange. You're talking about chapter 4, which is the chapter we're in, is this tour of all the tasks, and we're going to see how, but then you're telling me you're only going to show me one video on your favorite task? Well, okay, here's the reasoning. The execute SQL task is only so useful without either expressions or variables. And right now in the course, we have yet to cover variables and expressions. We've covered a tour of the tasks, which is kind of currently ongoing here in chapter 4. We've covered saving and encryption. We've covered a lot actually about SSIS, but we really haven't delved into variables and expressions yet. So here's what I'm going to do. I'm just going to show you the basics of what it is, what it does, how to use it. And then in chapter 5, 6, 7, 8, 9, we will further develop packages that are dynamic, that use expressions, variables, that do all of the features of the execute SQL task. So without further ado, I've got just a blank project up here. Let me actually close out of these. And that's something I'm going to show you here in just a minute. I'm just going to create an empty package. Not really going to do a whole lot here, but drag the execute SQL task onto the surface. So let's talk about what it is. The execute SQL task is a way to execute SQL commands. Now don't misconstrue what I just said to mean it only hooks up to SQL Server. It can hook up to any SQL based language. So take a look, I double click on it. Thankfully we have kind of everything on a single screen instead of the useless first general one sorry, now I'm getting nitpicky about SSIS here. Okay, let's talk about what we can do here within the execute SQL task. First off, the first thing I'm going to do is write my SQL statement. Okay, so the purpose of the execute SQL task is to execute a SQL statement. So what can you do in SQL? Then that's what you can do with your execute SQL task. Okay. Can we create tables? Yep. Execute stored procedures? You betcha. Execute stored procedures and do an insert statement after the stored procedure has? Oh yeah. Anything that you could do, for example, and I happen to be using SQL Server for this example. Anything that you can do right here in a SQL query window, you can do inside of an execute SQL task. Okay? You can have a whole bunch of these. You could have an insert, a go, a delete. This is kind of pushing the limits, a select, etc. So you can have all of this embedded in your execute SQL task. I have seen really, really long execute SQL tasks. Generally speaking, though, when you have a large amount of code that you want to run against, say, something like an Oracle server or a SQL server, what you'll do is you will compile that code into a stored procedure, and then you'll just simply execute the stored procedure. So we will be doing that in chapter 5 a great deal. We'll be passing parameters around. We'll be dealing with expressions and variables. One of the more common uses of the execute SQL task, particularly in the ETL world, is to do some sort of a table prep. So you have a table prep, like for example, we've got a scenario here, just kind of making it up, load data warehouse. So we want to load the data warehouse, however, we need to do some staging table work first. So I might have my execute SQL task do something like this. So I would come over here. I need to make my connection. Notice the connections that we can use. Remember that Excel and Access use the Jet SQL. So we can issue Jet SQL. We can issue commands in SQL against Excel. What's important to note is that there is no translation done here. So if I choose, for example, OLEDB, and I choose, let me just do that to show you here, and I make a connection to, let me choose a new connection, and notice my OLEDB, and I could choose over here Oracle. And so I choose an Oracle server, and I actually don't have one here on the network. But if I did choose an Oracle network, an Oracle server, then my code that I wrote right here, so you see the SQL statement, and I can put it right here. I just click right here. The code that I would run would actually be PLSQL. Okay, so that's very, very important. You are actually writing a host language query. This is not a query that will be translated into some other language. You are having to write in that actual language. You have to use the correct syntax. You have to use the right characters. Now, I want to explain a little bit more about how this idea of writing the query in the host language works. I'm going to use Excel. So I'll create an Excel spreadsheet, and I'm just going to save it, put it on the root of the C. You see the XLSX extension. It's an Excel 2007. It has 3 worksheets, 1, 2, and 3, that have no defined columns or data. So I'm going to change to Excel, and when I do that, I have to create a connection, and I need to make sure that I choose the 2007. I say browse, grab it. First row has column names. It doesn't matter, because what I'm actually going to do is I'm going to issue some DDL. So let me define a couple of things. You probably know this, but just in case this is new information to some people, let me just take a second to explain DDL and DML. So the SQL language is broken into some various groups, categories, classes, whatever you want to consider them. One of those is data definition language. This is what we use to define objects. So the main parts of this would be the create, alter, and drop statements. So we create tables, we drop tables, we create procedures, etc. Now, another big one would be the data manipulation language. And this is where you are doing your normal select, insert, update, and delete. So if you are a SQL-based language, you are going to implement these. And then the other one would be the DCL, the data control, just for completeness here. Okay. So I'm going to actually mix this quite a bit. I'm going to issue some DDL to create a table in the Excel spreadsheet. And then I'm going to issue some DML to insert into that data. Now, if you want to write this down, I'm about to erase it and go on, so you might want to pause the video. Okay. So my DDL is create table, Scott's table. And, so far this looks like PLSQL or Transact SQL. It could be any generic language, right? However, now that I'm defining, well, let's actually make this like customers. So we can use like a first name or like a customer ID. We'll just start there. Now I have to define the data type. So which data types do I use? Do I use the Transact SQL, the Oracle PLSQL? No, I use the Excel data types, right? So I would say long. And I would I could just do this. And it actually has the same terminator here for go, which says execute the previous lines. And now I can say insert into customers values 1, go. And I could do it again, insert into customers values 2. So this is going to be the table prep, maybe, for example, that we're doing. So I'm going to create a table, then I'm going to maybe populate it with some values, or maybe it's just a create table statement. If in many cases you're going to create your staging table in an execute SQL task, then you'd use a data flow task to populate the staging table. So you might just do the DDL here, and I'm looking for my pen, and I've dropped it on the ground. Sorry about that. Just to show you here, this statement here is the DDL. I had my pen reversed. So here's the DDL, and these two are the DML. And I know the pen kind of looks goofy when I'm zoomed in like that. I apologize. There, can't make it clearer there. So let's go ahead and do this. Let's execute this statement. Does it return a result set? No. I'll talk about that in just a second. But so it doesn't return a result set. I could set a timeout. The timeout of 0 means that it never times out. We set that in seconds. So if this doesn't come back after 30 seconds, SSIS would kill it. This code page deals with how Unicode translation works. So if I'm dealing with a variable in SSIS that stores the data, then what code page am I going to target? Okay, you need to know that. That's a little deeper than where we're going to go here. So I say, okay, this is direct input, which is meaning that I input it right here. I say go. And I'm going to disable this. We don't need that. But if I execute this now, it's gone to the Excel spreadsheet. It created the table, and then it loaded two errors. Now, we did get some errors over here. The OLEDB errors, no work was done. All right, we got really more warnings here. Let's take a look. Go up to book one. And it said no work was done, but really that is not quite true. You can see it did add the table. So the create table statement did actually create a new spreadsheet. And you can see that it did define the customer ID and put the data that we added into it. So we did a mix of DDL and DML in that execute SQL. And we had to use the host language. We had to know the data types in Excel so that we would be able to write the actual DDL. So very common. Like it's very common to have a situation like, I'll do another one here. Let me close out of here. So I'll say, I'll do that, call it Excel. And I'll save this as exec SQL 01. So it will be in the zip file with this video if you wanted to load up that DTSX file and take a look at it. I'm going to delete this data warehouse part because I don't, well, no, I'll just leave it. It doesn't hurt anything to have it. But like, let's say that we wanted to create a SQL Server table and then load the data into that table. Well, the execute SQL task is perfect. Come over here. So create table dbo.customers in SQL. And it doesn't like the period there. So create table customers. And so I would then connect up to my SQL server. So I would choose an OLEDB. If I want to connect to a SQL server to do a statement like a select or a create table, I use OLEDB. I then make my connection. I'm going to use the native client. And I use my database. So we will choose the learnitfirst.com database. And direct input. I could direct input it, but I'm going to do it a little different this time. I'm going to say, I'm going to go back to the Management Studio, or in case you didn't see that from a previous video, I'm going to launch the Management Studio, log in, and I'm going to write a, I don't know, a fairly decent statement. So if exists, select all from sys.tables, and here's what I'll do. I'll do this, use learnitfirst.com. I hit the control space to let it finish the autocomplete there. Where name equal customers, drop table dbo.customers. Now that's not probably the most robust statement, but it'll do. And then I want to create the table dbo.customers. And I want to create a customer ID column, not null, and it can be the primary key. And you might have other things that you wanted in here. Customer name, Envar car 256. You probably don't want that to be null, etc. And you'd have a lot of different columns associated with this, right? And so I can run this multiple times, and if the table exists, it will drop the table. If the table doesn't exist, it just goes and creates the table, and then it creates it. And so I want to save this now. Just at the root of the C drive, I will call this same thing, exec SQL 01.sql. And so now instead of doing the direct input, I'm going to say a file connection. And so my file is going to point us to that particular file, exec SQL 01. So now it's going to execute whatever is in that particular file. Okay? So let's do this before we execute this. Let's go to the learnitfirst.com database and let's just say drop table dbo.customers. Okay, and I can't run it twice because it doesn't exist. So there is no table customers. We execute our execute SQL task, creates the table. Now we can actually see. Now we didn't put any data in it, right? That's not what it did, but it actually created that table for us. Okay, so we can actually now come over here. We could modify our file now. Insert dbo.customers, values, 1, Scott, 2, Jamie. And if you're not familiar with this syntax, this is the new SQL 2008 syntax. So I can now save this. Let's drop our table again. Can't drop it when we run this again. It will now pick up the change that we made to the actual text file, the SQL file. And when we look at our select from the customers, you notice that it actually populated that. So executing it from a file is a nice way to make it very easy to edit what's going to happen outside of SSIS. I also like this because I can put it into source control. I can see the revisions and the changes, like SVN as we talked about earlier in the course. Now this is not all that we can do with the execute SQL task. Another thing that I could do with this, let me come over here and just pull this up, is I can actually return a result set. However, returning a result set requires us to use variables, and you're probably going to do some parameter mapping if we do stored procedures and variables. So I'm going to hold off on the result set side of things until chapter 5. So in chapter 5, I've got this whole section on doing parameter mapping with stored procedures, doing variables, doing expressions, dealing with result sets, how to loop through every row in a result set. So we're going to see plenty of it. Right now, we're just focusing on DML and DDL, but we're going to get much deeper into it from chapter 5 on.